good to see everybody, Mary, Roz, and great work the partnership has been doing. And I think it's a tribute to the sort of the tenacity of the partnership to produce results, even in a very difficult political environment. I think it's amazing. And certainly the contribution of Roz reminded me of COP26, and I think the STUC stood out in terms of its bold policy on public ownership. It's not all the union federations in the world support it openly as the STUC, but that's a longer story. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy is a growing network of unions that are fighting to reclaim energy to public ownership. But we understand that public ownership without a new mandate, and that would include a climate mandate, is not the solution. But without public ownership, there is virtually no chance of reaching climate targets within the timeframes established by science. Even with public ownership, it's going to be a very, very difficult task. But that's our point of departure. We need energy planning. We do need modern technologies, and that means digitalization across the system. We need to end electricity as a commodity, where the more you sell, the more money you make, which is completely contradictory to climate goals, and so on. So we developed a very rich analysis over the years with input from many people in this conversation. And we're building what we call a public pathway alternative to the current, what we call the neoliberal model. And I'm going to put up a few slides because what CHUED normally does is look at the global realities, but I don't want to distract.
Sean, sorry, you've gone back on mute.
I'm sorry, how long was I on mute?
15, 20 seconds, maybe.
No more. Okay. I was going to say, what CHUED normally does is look at the global energy trends, because they are politically very important to be clear about what is happening. And if it's okay, I'll share my screen now. Let me just try to do that with my own steam. I'm pretty much a boomer when it comes to these things. It says only one screen, one share at a time. How does this look? No? Are we good?
That's good.
Yep. How's that? Is that okay? Okay, great. I'll press on. So our basic analysis is that we're not witnessing an energy transition. And so what we're seeing is an expansion of energy use. All forms of energy, fossil fuels, renewables, everything is growing. And that the growth in renewables can often disguise that, or people think there is an energy transition. And this is an important point to make, because it implies that the policies are working, but they need to be implemented more aggressively, which leads to more privatization, more control of the multinationals, and so on. But if you say that it's not working, you have to draw a completely different political conclusion. Green growth is not working, and that's energy for profit approach, and we need an alternative. I want to make reference, because in case comrades don't know, there was a very significant meeting in Nairobi last October where we launched a South-South partnership with unions to fight for the public pathway alternative. We went into the meeting with this document. It's a 50,000-word document. I'm happy to share the draft on the challenges of the South. And everybody, I think, in this conversation knows that if we don't solve the problems and the challenges of the South, then there will be no reaching of climate targets. This is not meant to absolve the North of its responsibilities, quite the contrary. But it does show that there is very much an emergency situation in terms of underinvestment, and also a really out of control energy demand in many parts of the South, mostly fueled by coal, oil, and gas. This is a chart I just grabbed today. It shows really the bottom three bars there you can see is coal, oil, and gas. And yes, the renewables are growing, but they're not growing particularly fast enough, anything like fast enough. This is coal use. Everybody a few years ago was talking about the end of coal, and now we're seeing record use of coal globally. And that's obviously a massive challenge. And so that can lead to headlines like this, where you can see big record-breaking deployment of renewable energy, but also large increases in fossil fuel deployment. So these things can go together as part of an energy expansion. It's a reality, and it's not a pleasant one. This is a couple of years old, but the picture hasn't changed much. It shows that in terms of total energy consumption, where renewables stand. And obviously you can see wind and solar there pretty much low on the agenda. Now, one of the crises facing the current model is the lack of investment. And this is widely acknowledged even by the mainstream. They're saying there's just a fraction of the investment needed to reach net zero, or even anywhere close to net zero, frankly. It's just not being mobilized. And this idea that we need to mobilize the private sector by offering more and more subsidies, more and more incentives, has been a complete and utter policy disaster. For 30 years, it's been the same story, not enough investment. And now those chickens are coming home to roost. So we see that the policy has been about sticks and carrots. The stick was supposed to be carbon pricing, and the carrot was supposed to be subsidies and incentives. If we look at what the World Bank's latest data on carbon pricing is very revealing, you can see in this chart that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are actually priced is very, very small globally, but also even more significant is most of it is less than $10 US dollars per ton, which means it has absolutely no effect whatsoever on investment decisions. If you get charged $10 a ton for your emissions and you're a power station, or if you're a factory, you just pass that on to the consumer. You don't necessarily change your behavior as an investor. Workers know this. This was the yellow vest struggle 4 years ago, 4+ years ago now in France. There was an attempt to add, I think, half a euro onto a liter of diesel. The truckers and taxi drivers revolted for good reason, because they knew that they would be paying the tax for the so-called carbon, the pollution tax, but because they had to drive, the price would just be passed on to drivers, and you'd end up with paying for the emissions, and the emissions would end up being in the atmosphere anyway. So this is ridiculous policy. That's 30 years of failure. If you dig into the TUED documents, it's actually shocking how this policy has persisted for so long. Even today in Davos, or a few weeks ago in Davos for the World Economic Forum, we had the head of the IMF saying that we need a carbon price. Without a carbon price, carbon targets might as well be abandoned. And it's nowhere near being implemented. And probably good, it's a good thing it's not implemented, because it would be very regressive and not effective. Now, on the other side, we're seeing a lot of talk about the falling costs of renewables, but this is also leading to a major crisis of profitability in terms of many of the renewable energy companies. The more the prices go down, the more they have to bid against each other in competitive auctions, the lower the profit margins. The consequence of that is investors who are looking to make money, that's their fiduciary responsibility. They are running away from renewables in most parts of the world. Now, you could say, well, the investment levels have gone up. It's only gone up because of subsidies. When it's tied to a subsidy, the subsidy makes profitable what would, under a market system, not be profitable. So they are protected from the market. We see this in the EU. We see this in the United States and other parts of the world. The renewables are subsidized, but it's a transfer of public money into private hands. And that money should be kept to use as part of a public investment strategy and a public ownership, anchored in public ownership. Here's another expression of the problem. You can see these are the profit levels for renewables compared to coal. And you can see then, if you're an investor, you would look at that and say, I think I'll put my money in coal, which is why the capitalist model of energy transition can never work. because it's based on profit considerations and not social and ecological considerations. Here's the investment deficit. I won't spend too much time on this. You can see the pale green there is the band of investment annually needed, and you can see where it currently stands, way, way below what's needed. Now, what about these just energy transition partnerships? The meeting in Nairobi was about address this idea that the North is going to help the South transition away from coal. And you can see this is happening now in several countries, maybe as many as a dozen countries. Don't have time to unpack these partnerships, but here's the one with South Africa. De-risk investment there at the bottom is crucial, because it basically says, if we, the private investors, are going to put our money in, we need to be guaranteed returns on investment. That's what de-risking means. Who pays for that? The public pays for that in the form of higher energy costs, in the form of loss of investment in other areas of the public sector, and so on. So recently a report came out and talked about this idea that if the World Bank and the IMF put a little bit of money on the table, that the private sector are going to be like flies around you-know-what in terms of gravitating towards this little pot of money. It doesn't happen. This is the Overseas Development Institute saying needs a reality check. Now, bear in mind that this is the policy for most of the global South, which is to catalyze investment in the private sector. You see nearly all of the investment, 80% of investment in the energy transition in renewables is in the global North. Only 1/5 is in the South, and yet that's where nearly all of the new emissions will come from. It's a nonsensical situation, and it speaks to the need for a global Green New Deal and a reassessment of the multilateral system in terms of its role in the climate protection effort. Now, turning in the few minutes I have left into what I think is more encouraging news. This picture was taken by me in Johannesburg 13 years ago, when the unions there said we need public ownership of energy. It fell on deaf ears then, but it's beginning to gather momentum globally, and I'll show you some examples of that. This is Korea, where the Korean unions, they're not as strong as they used to be, but they're still very influential in policy. They are talking about rebundling the public utilities that were divided into 6 companies, rebundling it into one public company in order to drive the energy transition in Korea. This is Public Services International talking about bringing public services back in-house, but they're also doing a lot of work on energy, and they have been very supportive of the work that CHUET has been doing on reclaiming energy. This was a fight last year that CGT won a victory in France, which was to stop the privatization of EDF. Of course, EDF has been marketized. It's very much like a multinational corporation now, but it's still publicly owned. And this point was made, I think, by both Ross and Craig, that public companies are the ones doing a lot of the investing overseas. And this reclaiming and demarketization is going to be critical. This was in Glasgow, and picture of Ross there, when we brought unions together and worked on this trade union program for a public energy future, which I would urge comrades to take a look at. It's not a list of demands. It's basically an approach to reclaim the energy system by repealing the neoliberal laws of the 80s and 90s. Now, I'm just going to skip forward here. This is the mine workers. This is the first time, I think, this is the largest mining union in the African continent, adopted the public pathway position, which was to reclaim energy to public ownership and to defend the public utility, Eskom, from privatization, but with a reform agenda attached to it. This is day-to-day front page news in South Africa at the moment. But we see other countries are, basically moving back towards a sort of a public ownership approach. This is Vietnam, where the Vietnamese government was praised for its privatization agenda around renewables. They're now scaling back on renewables, which is not good news. But the problem is the privatization of the system, which is causing expense and technical challenges to the grids that need to be addressed. This is Fitch, the rating company, saying state-owned enterprises are key to the energy transition. No one would have expected them to say that 4 or 5 years ago. And it's largely because they've woken up to the reality that unless the large energy producers are renationalized, demarketized, and pushed through an energy transition with an emphasis on energy efficiency and conservation, then climate targets won't be reached. A couple of significant stories recently. This is Uganda, cancelled its independent power producer program, which is, again, highly expensive, very similar to the sort of renewable energy power purchase agreements we see in Scotland and all over Europe. This was a cancellation of those and a decision to renationalize. This is Honduras. Of course, the mainstream pro-business media called their cancellation of the independent power producers a setback, but it's actually a good step forward from the point of view of the left and in reclaiming energy to public ownership. This is Ghana, where their debts are $900 million to the independent power producers. They've decided to renegotiate and cancel many of their deals with the IPPs. In fact, Ghana, let me just go backwards quickly. Ghana preferred to pay $400 million in compensation to the multinationals than honor the contracts into the late 20s and early 2030s, because it was going to cost the country far too much money. From a point of view of renewable energy, this is not good news from the point of view of transition, because it basically imposes costs on governments that they can't afford to pay in the interest of profit. But it's basically slowing down the energy transition in many parts of the world where it needs to accelerate. This is Zimbabwe. They're basically calling it rebundling, which is to when the World Bank comes in and tries to privatize power systems, it calls for the unbundling or breaking up into pieces the public utility. Zimbabwe took a decision to reassemble its public utility and to halt its dependency on private multinationals. This, I think, is particularly significant. This is 45% of the world's deployment last year in terms of gigawatts of renewable energy was in China. And you can see there in that headline that the public entities are driving the transition in China. We have to be honest, though. There's a lot of new coal coming online in China as well, a lot of nuclear, a lot of gas. But they are the leader, the world leader in terms of deployment, in terms of volume and percentages of renewable energy. And it opens up the door to a public pathway alternative based not on power purchase agreements or multinationals, but based on state-owned enterprises when those enterprises are given the correct mandate. Last slide. This, I think, is probably the most interesting story. This is the president of Mexico, who elected 3 or 4 years ago, is a hugely popular president. One of the campaigns was restore Mexico's energy sovereignty. They've canceled the independent power producer program, and they're embarking on a public energy transition where they don't purchase power. They purchase technologies, yes, from foreign suppliers. They don't make their own solar panels. They don't make their own wind turbines. But there's no reason why a government that hasn't the capacity manufacturing needs to buy electricity on a power purchase contract for 25 years. That's going to see so much in terms of profits leave those countries in the form of power charges. So the decision is to move towards a public system. They've reorganized their hydroelectric systems, upgraded them, and they're moving now into what is the largest solar project in Latin America, currently 450 megawatts. It's going to go up to 1.1 gigawatts by 2027. I think, comrades, this is the kind of message, this is the kind of public approach that we need if we're going to plan a transition, mobilize the investment. We don't want to be further indebted with the multinationals who will only invest if there's a profit in it or if there's a subsidy that basically makes that investment profitable. And in the case of the Global South, this is the only option, because rich countries can afford to subsidize renewables. Poor countries won't be able to do it. And we need a different approach. So I'll stop there and wish you every success in the work you're doing in Scotland. And I'm with you there in spirit and hope to get back there one day soon. Thanks.